Alright guys and girls, I'm Obsidian and welcome back to Elite Dangerous. For many gamers, narrative forms an important role. Now, single player games like GTA 5 would be missing a lot without narrative. God of War would also be an empty world without it. Even online games such as World of Warcraft have a foot in the realms of narrative driven content. However, in each case, narrative means something different from game to game. What then does it mean for Elite? Well, that really should be a very easy question to answer, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to be that straightforward, at least not to those who just get on and play the game without paying attention to external resources. That then gives us an indication of where to look. Elite Dangerous is a very lore-intensive game. It does have a narrative, but it's one that is largely delivered in text form through news articles released on Galnet, Elite's text-based news service. Now, Galnet is easily accessible, it's available in-game, and it is even narrated.
Review. Here are this week's major stories.
Meaning you can listen to the news as you fly. But this really is a very different type of narrative to many games players may be used to. It's about as far away from GTA 5 as you can get. In fact, it would be like relying on the radio stations in GTA to deliver you narrative. And, well, yeah, that would be far from ideal.
The Alliance Assembly has agreed to vote on President Gibson Kincaid's proposed changes to the Constitution.
It's also very different to almost any other MMO out there. And yes, you're right, it is an unfair comparison, but it would be wrong not to at least highlight these differences. So in a game world where narrative is delivered through text via news services, where does this leave the game players? To what degree can they interact with such a narrative, and to what degree does that narrative affect their day-to-day gameplay? Well, this would largely depend upon the player and their location. Situated near the latest Thargoid attack? Well, you would directly fill the narrative here with burning stations. On the other hand, the royal wedding for the characters Ashlyn Duval to Rochester, well, you wouldn't really notice anything about that regardless of your location. Narrative in Elite Dangerous then is not only text-based, but it does largely lack impact upon the broader game world. In short, many of the articles that are available on Galnet are simply fluff pieces. They are a decent backdrop to the game world, but you will never experience much of that content directly. You cannot meet the characters or even see their impact upon anything. Most of those Galnet stories will not change anything, and for a lot of players that isn't narrative, at least as they are used to experiencing it in a video game. And there is a reason for this. Elite Dangerous is a curated galaxy. Imagine for a moment, if you will, the world of Elite as a vast tabletop Dungeons & Dragons game, a pen and paper game in the traditional sense. The galaxy is the area we collectively share, and Frontier are the dungeon masters guiding and controlling the events that unfold within the game. They don't do this in the traditional video game sense of introducing cutscenes, boss fights or levels. Instead, in this hypothetical situation, they guide the story through pre-written plot lines. Here's some examples of some things that actually have been put in this way. The discovery of the Thargoid artifacts, initiated by players of course, but placed by Frontier with a predetermined outcome. The discovery of the Thargoid bases, again placed by Frontier, discovered by players, but initiated by Frontier with a predetermined outcome. The same is also true of the Guardian beacons. The game world then is expanded in this way, and a fluff piece is written to explain how this all happened, and then that will appear on Galnet, and it will perpetuate itself through the forums, through YouTube videos, and through many other social media forms. However, this news will not spread directly in-game, with the exception of through Galnet. Now, the unfortunate thing is that whilst you can interact with these areas, you cannot affect them. Ultimately, you play no part in that story. As a player, you are irrelevant. The Dungeon Master, Frontier in this case, reveals a new room, and you can decide to either go into it or ignore it. But either way, it's not a room you can have any influence over in the traditional sense of a video game. And again, that brings us to the point that this really isn't narrative as video game players are using it. But is it still a form of narrative? Well, that's a question, isn't it? Now, to be fair, Frontier do occasionally involve players in this form of narrative, and the recent event with the megaship Gnosis is a good example of this. Now, we'll know about the history of that, no doubt pretty much everyone has heard, but I will recount it very, very briefly here. Essentially, the player group Cannon wanted to move their megaship into an area of space known as the Cone Sector, which was, interestingly enough, surrounded by permit-locked systems. In short, their target destination was unlocked, however it was surrounded by locked systems, thereby making their target destination inaccessible. Now Cannon approached Frontier with this request, and Frontier quickly realised that this area of space should be completely locked with no access at all. Now rather than simply throwing a switch and changing the system's permits, Frontier decided to weave the players into a narrative. It was announced that the Gnosis would indeed move into this area, and 11,000 players decided to come along for the ride. In a narrative twist, Frontier initiated an alien Thargoid attack on the Gnosis, causing it to foul its jump. It ultimately ended up in a very different location, just jumping 12 light years, and a planned exploration expedition very quickly become a combat zone. Now the signs that this would happen were there all along, and Frontier fed the narrative via the game's Galnet newsfeed. The problem, however, is exactly as I already established. Many players do not read Galnet. Further, many players are not used to this form of Dungeon Master driven narrative in a video game. And that really makes sense, doesn't it? Because this is a video game. It's not a pen and paper RPG. So for me, the question about narrative in Elite is this. Is narrative something that we as players can interact with as we normally would with any other video game? Or is narrative, for Elite Dangerous, something that we as players are just meant to follow in the same way that we would follow a book or a movie? It really is an important difference, and the fact that the game's intention isn't clear on this really does speak volumes. This then brings me back to everyone's favourite subject, personal narrative. Personal narrative in Elite is the way we unlock items within the game. Currently, this involves unlocking various Guardian technology through a variety of different processes. Most of these involve repetitive game loops. Now, it seems Frontier consider these things as narrative because they hook into the background story. For example, to unlock the Guardian fighter, you'll need to visit the Guardian beacons and ruins. But again, this is not narrative in the sense that most game players are used to experiencing it. There is no real story in the player's actions here. You are not interacting with any characters or affecting the game world in any way. You're not even completing any objectives or goals that the game sets. The term narrative really feels as though it is stretched rather thin here. So, yeah, a Dungeon Master revealing a new goal for people to go and complete whilst not really giving them any meat. To bring this to a conclusion, it isn't that narrative within Elite or even Frontier's approach that is the actual problem. Now clearly thousands of people enjoy this stuff and actively engage with it. Heck, I'm even a fan of the lore myself. The issue, and there is an issue here, a rather big one in fact, is that whilst Frontier are a cool Dungeon Master, they seem to be more focused on getting players to the goal of their story rather than the players' interest and actions themselves. Now this might be a result of working with video games. After all, if players go wandering over to an area that you haven't finished working on, then that is going to be a problem. But it does set a stage for expectations. Elite is a video game after all. It's not a book. Most players don't mind being guided through a narrative, but it is important that they are aware of what that narrative is and its potential directions, and they need to be fed this in more ways than just through a text-based news feed. There's plenty of ways of doing that in video games. That sort of technology has been developed for decades now, and people have got very, very efficient with it, and it shouldn't be too hard to take advantage of this with Elite Dangerous. As a bigger aside, I'd say that it's also very important to not label things as narrative that clearly aren't. For here, the Guardian weapons come to mind. Now, if they are intended to be narrative, then they need to be weaved into a story rather than into a grind. That then is just a few of my thoughts and feelings on narrative as it applies to Elite Dangerous. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings. Do let me know in the comments section below. What do you think of narrative? Does Elite do it very well? Does it need more gameplay, or is text-based newsfeed enough? As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.